The shuttle named Carthage drifted through the endless dark toward a station that looked like a ring of frozen lightning wrapped around a dead star. And inside that shuttle sat 6 humans who were about to change the galaxy forever, without even trying. Ambassador Idris Okonkwo sat in the forward cabin, with his hands resting on his knees, and his eyes closed, breathing slow and steady, the way he always did before something important. And beside him, Captain Ilara Voss sat with her back straight, and her gray eyes scanning the viewport like a hawk watching an open field. Because that was what she did, and that was what she had always done. The station was called the Athenaeum Primalis, and it was the most important place in the known galaxy, a neutral ground where the 34 species of the Galactic Concord met to talk and argue and make decisions that shaped the lives of trillions. And today, for the first time in its long history, a 35th species had been invited to sit at the inner table. That species was humanity. Okonkwo opened his eyes and looked at Voss and said, "How are we looking, Captain?" And Voss did not turn her head, but answered, "3 patrol cruisers on the outer ring, standard formation, docking lane is clear, no anomalies on passive scan." And Okonkwo nodded and said, "Good." And then after a pause he added, "Try to smile when we get out there, Ilara. We are guests after all." And Voss almost smiled, but not quite. Behind them sat the rest of the team. Sergeant Ren Tanaka, who was Voss's second-in-command, and built like a wall of muscle wrapped in calm patience. Corporal Yua Ishida, who was small and fast, and had eyes that missed nothing. Specialist Devon Hargrove, who looked like a friendly college professor, but could kill a man in 9 different ways with his bare hands. And senior diplomat Amara Diallo, who was Okonkwo's right hand, and carried herself with the kind of quiet grace that made people want to trust. 6 humans. That was all. Walking into a station filled with thousands of aliens from dozens of species, many of whom thought humanity was too young and too savage and too strange to deserve a place among them. The shuttle docked with a soft hiss, and the doors opened, and the humans stepped out into the receiving hall of the Athenaeum. And the hall was enormous, with ceilings that stretched up into glowing blue light, and walls made of some kind of living crystal that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. And standing in rows along the walkway were representatives of nearly every species in the Concord, watching, judging, measuring. The first to greet them was Envoy Thesic Volaron of the Velhari, the senior chair of the inner table, and he was tall, nearly 8 feet, with skin that looked like cracked blue glass, and eyes that glowed with a faint white light. And he moved with the slow, careful grace of someone who had been important for a very long time. "Ambassador Okonkwo," Thesic said, in a voice that resonated like a struck bell. "The Concord welcomes humanity to the Athenaeum Primalis. May your presence here mark the beginning of a long and fruitful partnership." Okonkwo stepped forward and extended his hand in the human way, and said, "Envoy Thesic, it is an honor that I cannot put into words. My people have dreamed of this moment since we first looked up at the stars, and we are grateful beyond measure." And Thesic looked at the offered hand for a moment, and then carefully took it, his crystalline fingers wrapping around Okonkwo's dark skin, and something passed between them in that handshake that neither of them could have named. Behind Thesic stood the other envoys, dozens of them, and Voss catalogued every single one without appearing to look at any of them. The Dothani, who were small and soft-bodied, and known for their scholarship. The Morhavi, who were tall and feathered, and carried themselves like dancers. The Brek, who looked like walking boulders and spoke in rumbles that shook the floor. And many others. And then there were the Keshari. Envoy Drethmora stepped forward, with his forearms spread wide, in what was supposed to be a gesture of welcome. And his scales were deep green, and his teeth were very white. And his smile was the kind of smile that Voss had learned long ago to never trust, because it was too wide and too easy, and it never quite reached his golden eyes. "Ambassador," Drethmora said, "what a pleasure. We Keshari have long admired humanity's spirit. Your rise has been remarkable, truly remarkable." And Okonkwo thanked him warmly, and shook one of his 4 hands, and moved on. But Voss noticed that Mora's other 3 hands had tightened into fists for just a fraction of a second. The reception that followed was held in a grand hall filled with floating platforms and cascading light, and food from 100 worlds, and the humans mingled with aliens who towered over them, and aliens who barely reached their waists, and aliens who had no legs at all. And through it all, Okonkwo moved like water, shaking hands and trading stories, and laughing with genuine warmth that confused more than a few species who had expected humans to be stiff and aggressive. But while Okonkwo charmed the room, Voss worked. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her cybernetic threat detection suite running passive scans on everything within 50 meters, and what she found made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Because there were micro-fluctuations in the station's thermal regulation system that suggested something was hiding inside the walls, something that was generating heat and then masking it, and there were chemical traces in the air recyclers that her implants flagged as consistent with a paralytic compound called Vexus 9, which was colorless and odorless and very, very illegal. She found Tanaka by the east wall and said, quietly, "We have a problem." And Tanaka looked at her and said, "The thermal ghosts in the walls." And Voss raised an eyebrow, because she had not told him yet. And Tanaka shrugged and said, "I noticed them 20 minutes ago. Also, there are 3 people in this room whose biometric profiles do not match anyone in the delegate registry." Voss almost smiled, almost, and said, "Activate the network, passive mode only, and get me a line to the ambassador." She found Okonkwo between conversations, and leaned close and said, "Sir, we have multiple threat indicators. Possible pale cord involvement. I recommend immediate extraction." And Okonkwo looked at her with calm, steady eyes, and said, "If we leave now, it is over. Everything we have worked for, everything Earth has worked for, gone." And Voss held his gaze, and said, "Understood, sir." And Okonkwo put a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Do what you do, Captain." And so she did. She activated the team's passive threat detection network system that linked all 4 soldiers through their neural implants into a shared tactical awareness field. And suddenly, she could feel Tanaka's calm focus, and Ishida's sharp attention, and Hargrove's steady readiness, like extra limbs attached to her own mind. And together they watched and waited. The reception ended, and the delegates began moving toward the inner chamber for the ceremony that would change humanity's place in the galaxy. And as the crowd filtered through the great doors, Voss saw something that made her blood run cold. Dreth Mora stood in a shadowed observation gallery above the hall, and he was not alone. And the figure beside him was wrapped in something that bent the light around it like heat haze rising from hot pavement. And Mora leaned close to that figure and whispered something in Keshari that Voss's translation implant caught and decoded in an instant. "When they sit, not before." Voss said nothing. She simply tightened her jaw and walked forward into the inner chamber, with her hand resting casually at her side, 3 inches from her weapon. And the weight of what was coming settled onto her shoulders like an old, familiar coat. She had worn it before. She would wear it again. The inner chamber of the Galactic Concord was the most impressive room that any human had ever stood in. And that was saying something, because humans had built some very impressive rooms over the centuries. But this was something else entirely. It was shaped like a vast bowl carved from living stone, with 34 floating platforms arranged in a spiral that rose toward a ceiling of open starlight, each platform glowing with the colors of the species it belonged to: blue for the Velhari, green for the Keshari, deep amber for the Morhavi, stone gray for the Brek, and on in a rainbow of alien civilizations. And at the very center of the spiral, floated a single empty platform that glowed with a soft white light. The 35th seat. Humanity's seat. Okonkwo stood at the entrance to the chamber and looked up at that empty platform. And for just a moment, his calm mask slipped and something raw and real moved across his face. Wonder and pride. And the weight of 8 billion people resting on his shoulders. And then the mask was back, and he was smiling and walking forward with the easy confidence that had made him the most respected diplomat on Earth. The ceremony began with Thesic Volaron rising on his blue platform and speaking in that bell-like voice that carried through the chamber without any amplification, because the Velhari did not need machines to make themselves heard. For 11,000 years the Concord has gathered in this chamber to speak and to listen and to build something greater than any one species could build alone, Thesic said. Today we consider whether a new voice should join that conversation, a young voice, a strange voice, a voice from a small blue world orbiting an unmarkable star in the outer arm of this galaxy. He paused and looked down at the human delegation standing on the chamber floor, and his glowing eyes lingered on them for a long moment. Let the candidates speak. Okonkwo stepped forward onto a speaking platform that rose gently beneath his feet and lifted him up to the level of the lowest ring of seats. And he stood there with his hands at his sides and looked around the chamber at the faces of 34 species, and he began to speak. I am not going to pretend that humanity is perfect, he said, and his voice was warm and steady, and it filled the chamber the way a campfire fills a dark night. We are not. We have fought wars that burned entire continents. We have built weapons that could have ended all life on our world. We have hated each other for the color of our skin and the shape of our beliefs, and 1,000 other foolish reasons. The chamber was very quiet. But we are still here, Okonkwo continued. Every time we fell, we got back up. Every time we broke ourselves, we put the pieces back together. Not because we are strong, not because we are special, but because we are stubborn, because something inside us refuses to accept that the story is over. And I believe that stubbornness, that refusal to quit, is the most human thing about us. He looked up at Thesic and said, We do not ask for this seat because we deserve it. We ask for it because we want to earn it, because we want to add our voice to yours and help build something that lasts, not just for our children, but for all of yours as well. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of very different people all feel the same thing at the same time, and even the species that had come here expecting to vote against humanity found themselves leaning forward just slightly. On his green platform far above, Dreth Mora sat very still, with all 4 hands folded in his lap, and his golden eyes fixed on Okonkwo with an expression that could have been admiration, but was actually something much colder. Meanwhile, Voss was not listening to the speech because she already knew what Okonkwo would say, and she had more important things to focus on, and those things were trying to kill the ambassador. Her neural implant had been running continuous passive scans since they entered the chamber, and the data was coming together like pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture she did not like at all. The thermal signatures in the walls were moving, slowly, carefully, 12 distinct heat sources that were being masked by some kind of cloaking technology that was very good, but not quite good enough to fool a human-built detection suite that had been designed by people who were very paranoid for very good reasons. The chemical trace of Vexus 9 was stronger in here, concentrated around the ventilation ducts above the central platform, the exact spot where Okonkwo would be standing when he took the 35th seat. And the 3 unregistered individuals had positioned themselves at 3 equidistant points around the chamber floor, forming a triangle that any tactical mind would recognize as a kill box. Voss opened her shared tactical network and pushed her data to Tanaka and Ishida and Hargrove. and she felt their responses like pulses of electricity. Tanaka's grim confirmation, Ishida's sharp spike of focus, Hargrove's steady, controlled anger. She had a choice to make. She could pull Okonkwo out right now, trigger an emergency evacuation, and get her people to safety, and the threat would be neutralized and everyone would live. But humanity's candidacy would be dead, because pulling your ambassador out of the most important ceremony in galactic history, because you detected a threat that no one else could see, would look like cowardice or paranoia or both, and the Concord would never invite them back. Or she could stay and fight. She chose to fight. She always chose to fight. Through the network, she sent a rapid series of tactical commands. Tanaka was to handle the aerial threat, meaning the microdrones. In the ventilation system, Ishida and Hargrove were to cover the flanks, and Voss herself would cover the direct approach to Okonkwo. And all of this was communicated in less than a second through neural impulse alone, without a single word spoken or a single visible movement made. On the surface, the 4 human soldiers looked exactly as they had before, calm and still and professionally attentive, like bodyguards at any diplomatic event on any world. But beneath that surface, 4 minds were now running combat calculations at a speed that would have frightened every alien in the room if they had known about it. The speeches continued, one species after another rising to welcome or challenge or question humanity's place among them. And through it all, Okonkwo stood with patience and grace and answered every question with honesty and warmth. And he was magnificent, truly magnificent. And Voss wished she could watch him work, but she could not, because the thermal signatures in the walls were getting closer. Fesik Valeron spoke again, and his voice rang through the chamber. The candidate has spoken, and the Concord has heard. Let the candidate now approach the 35th seat, and let the vote commence. And Okonkwo smiled that warm, steady smile, and turned and began walking toward the white platform that floated in the center of the chamber. And with every step he took, Voss tracked the 12 heat sources converging on his position, and the microdrones spinning up in the ventilation ducts, and the 3 unregistered operatives on the chamber floor shifting their weight forward onto the balls of their feet. And in the final moment, before everything happened, Voss felt a sensation she had not felt since her last combat deployment on Earth 7 years ago. That strange slowing of time that happened when her augmented nervous system shifted from passive scanning to active combat mode, and the world became sharp and bright, and every detail burned itself into her awareness with perfect clarity. Okonkwo's foot touched the white platform. The walls exploded open, and Voss's neural implant screamed a single word directly into the core of her brain. Contact. Her hand was already moving. What happened next took exactly 2 seconds from start to finish. And in those 2 seconds, the galaxy learned something about humanity that it would never forget. 0.00 seconds. 12 panels in the walls and ceiling of the inner chamber blew open simultaneously, and from those openings came 12 Vreth assassins of the Pale Court. And the Vreth were a species that had been bred for one purpose and one purpose only: killing. They stood 7 feet tall with 4 arms that ended in blade-like claws, and their skin could bend light around their bodies, making them nearly invisible. They had never failed an assignment in 300 years of operation, and each of these 12 had personally killed hundreds of targets across dozens of worlds. They came in fast and silent and deadly, and they expected this to be easy because it was always easy, because no species in the history of the Concord had ever survived a Pale Court ambush. Ever. They did not know what they were about to walk into. 0.05 seconds. Voss's cybernetic reflex suite activated at full combat speed, and the world around her slowed to a crawl, like she was moving through water, while everything else was frozen in amber. And her hand closed around the grip of her sidearm, which was a compact plasma pistol, that looked small and harmless, and was neither of those things, and she began to draw. Across the chamber, Tanaka felt the same shift as his own augmentations kicked in, and his hand went to the EMP emitter built into his left wrist guard. And Ishida's fingers found the grip of her flechette weapon hidden beneath her dress uniform, and Hargrove dropped his weight into a fighting stance that his body knew better than his own name. 0.10 seconds. Voss's threat detection AI completed its analysis of the 12 incoming hostiles, their speed and trajectory and threat level, and the optimal firing solution for each one, and it fed all of that data directly into her motor cortex, bypassing the slow, clumsy process of conscious thought entirely. And her body began to move with a precision that was not entirely human anymore, but was something more. Something that generations of military science and cybernetic engineering had built for exactly this moment. 0.20 seconds, and pushed the data through the neural network to her team, and in an instant, all four of them knew exactly what they needed to do. 0.20 seconds. Two of the Vreth assassins were faster than the others, and they lunged straight at Okonkwo with their blade arms extended, crossing the distance with a speed that would have been invisible to most species. And their molecular edge claws could cut through starship armor like paper, and Okonkwo was right there, exposed, standing on that white platform with no cover and no weapon. Voss fired twice. The plasma bolts left her weapon as superheated points of blue-white light and crossed the gap between her and the assassins in 0.03 of a second. And the first bolt hit the lead assassin directly between its compound eyes, and the second bolt hit the other one in the center of its chest, and both of them dropped out of the air mid-leap and crashed to the chamber floor as smoking ruins, dead before they knew they were dead. The sound of the shots had not even reached the walls yet. 0.30 seconds. Above them, the ventilation ducts burst open, and a swarm of micro-drones poured out like a cloud of metal insects, each one loaded with Vexus 9, enough paralytic compound to drop every living thing in the chamber within seconds. And this was the backup plan, because the Pale Court always had a backup plan. Tanaka raised his left arm and triggered the localized EMP pulse built into his wrist unit, and a wave of electromagnetic force expanded outward in a sphere, and every single micro-drone within range died instantly, their tiny engines sputtering out and their metal bodies falling from the air like rain, clattering against the stone floor in a sound like 1,000 tiny bells. 0.45 seconds. Four more assassins came from the flanks, 2 from the left and 2 from the right, moving in a coordinated attack pattern that had been designed to overwhelm any defensive formation. And they were fast, terrifyingly fast, their light-bending skin making them shimmer like heat haze as they closed in. Ishida stepped forward and brought her flechette weapon up and fired a burst that filled the air with a cloud of razor-thin projectiles, moving at 3 times the speed of sound. And 2 of the left-side assassins ran directly into that cloud, and the flechettes tore through their light-bending skin like it was not there, and they came apart in a spray of dark fluid and collapsed in heaps. Hargrove met the first right-side assassin head-on, and what happened next was something that the watching aliens would replay on their recording devices hundreds of times in the days that followed, and still not fully understand. Because Hargrove caught the assassin's leading blade arm in both hands and twisted, and the arm broke at the joint with a crack that echoed through the chamber. And then he stepped inside the assassin's reach and wrapped his hands around its head and wrenched, and the Vreth's neck snapped, and it fell. The whole thing took him less than half a second, and he was already turning toward the 4th flanking assassin before the body hit the ground. 0.70 seconds. Voss advanced on the 4th assassin, which was the fastest and smartest of the 12, and it actually dodged her first shot, twisting its body with a fluid motion that bent the plasma bolt past its shoulder. And for one instant, it looked like it might reach Okonkwo. But Voss did not fire again. Instead, she closed the chamber, distance and 3 explosive steps, and a combat knife appeared in her left hand, as if it had materialized from thin air, and she drove it upward through the soft tissue beneath the assassin's jaw and into its brain. And the assassin shuddered once and went still, and Voss pulled the blade free and kept moving. 1 second had passed, 1 single second, and 6 of the 12 deadliest assassins in the galaxy were dead. The remaining 6 breath hesitated, and that hesitation was something that had never happened before in the history of the Pale Court, because the Pale Court did not hesitate. They struck and they killed and they vanished. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. But nothing about this was working, and the targets were not dying, and their own people were falling, and the universe had stopped making sense. 1.10 seconds. Okonkwo stepped backward off the white platform and positioned himself directly behind Voss. Told, moving with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had drilled emergency positioning protocols hundreds of times until they were as natural as breathing. And his face was calm, and his heartbeat was elevated by only 12 beats per minute above his resting rate. Because Idris Okonkwo had grown up in Lagos and had survived a building collapse at age 9 and a terrorist attack at age 22, and had learned very early in life that panic was a luxury he could not afford. He trusted Voss. He trusted her completely, and so he stood behind her and he waited. 1.30 seconds. Voss and Tanaka moved. They moved together, in a pattern that the Velhari security analysts would later describe in their official report as a synchronized predatory response without observable communication, which was a clinical way of saying that 2 humans flowed through that chamber like a single killing machine with 4 arms and 2 guns and a shared mind. Went left and Voss went right, and they cut through the remaining assassins with plasma fire and close-quarters violence that was so fast and so efficient that it looked almost choreographed, like a dance, except the dancers left bodies on the floor. One of the assassins got close enough to Tanaka to slash a blade across his left forearm, and the molecular edge cut through his sleeve and hit the subdermal armor plating beneath his skin and skidded along it, leaving a shallow cut that bled red and hissed where the alien metal touched human blood. And Tanaka did not even flinch. He just shot that assassin in the face and moved on to the next one. 1.80 seconds. The last breath assassin fell, and it fell hard, and it did not get up. 2.00 seconds. Silence. The inner chamber of the Galactic Concord was utterly and completely silent, in a way that it had never been silent before, because every single alien in that room was frozen, by the paralytic compound which Tanaka had neutralized, but by shock, by pure, absolute, brain-stopping shock. Not one of them had activated their personal shields. Not one of them had drawn a weapon. Not one of them had even moved, because the attack had begun and ended so fast that their nervous systems had not finished processing the first shot before the last body hit the floor. 12 Pale Court assassins, the most feared killers in the galaxy, deployed in a perfectly coordinated ambush that should have been unstoppable. Dead, all 12 of them, in 2 seconds. Voss holstered her weapon and touched her earpiece and said in a voice as flat and steady as a machine, "Threat neutralized. Ambassador is secure." And Okonkwo straightened his jacket and brushed a fleck of alien blood from his sleeve and looked up at the thousands of stunned faces staring down at him from their floating platforms. And he smiled that warm, steady smile and said, "My apologies for the interruption. Shall we continue?" Nobody answered. Nobody could. The hours that followed the attack were louder than the attack itself, not in sound, but in the sheer volume of fear and confusion and wonder that poured through the Athenaeum Primalis like a flood through a broken dam. The inner chamber was sealed and declared a crime scene by the station security directorate, and every delegation was escorted to their quarters, while investigators swarmed the room with scanning equipment and evidence drones. But nobody cared about the investigation, because the investigation was not the interesting part. The interesting part was the 2 seconds of footage that every recording device in the chamber had captured, and that was now being played and replayed and analyzed on every diplomatic channel in the station. Thesek Valoran sat alone in his private quarters and watched the footage for the 14th time. He had slowed it down to 1/100th of normal speed, which meant that the 2 seconds of real time stretched into 3 minutes and 20 seconds of playback. And even at that speed, the humans moved with a fluidity that made his crystalline skin crawl. Because at 100th speed, he could finally see what had actually happened. And what had actually happened was impossible. He watched Voss draw her weapon and fire twice before the first assassin had fully emerged from the wall. He watched Tanaka identify and neutralize the drone threat, while simultaneously tracking 4 additional hostiles on his tactical display. He watched Ishida fire a flechette burst with a spread pattern so precise that it killed 2 targets and missed every bystander in a crowded room. He watched Hargrove break a Vreth blade arm with his bare hands, which should not have been physically possible, because Vreth bones were denser than structural steel. And he watched Okonkwo step calmly behind his bodyguard, with the casual grace of a man stepping out of the rain. Time benchmarks for every species in the Concord, and he laid the human data beside the best the galaxy had to offer. The Velhari Elite Guard had an average threat response time of 1.8 seconds, and they were considered among the fastest in the Concord. The Keshari Special Forces came in at 1.4 seconds, the Morhavi at 1.6, and the Brek, who were the most physically powerful species known, did not even register on the speed charts, because they were built for endurance, not reflexes. The humans had responded in 0.05 of a second. Thesek sat very still for a very long time after reading that number, and then he called his senior aide into the room and said, "I need you to pull every xenobiological file we have on humans, every single one, and I need it within the hour." And his aide asked why, and Thesek said, "Because I think we have made a terrible mistake in how we have understood these people." Keshari Delegation Quarters. The mood was very different. Dreth Mora stood in the center of his private chamber, with all 4 hands clenched and his scales flickering between dark green and pale yellow, which was the Keshari equivalent of barely controlled panic. Because the plan had failed. The plan that he had spent 2 years and an enormous amount of money putting together had failed in 2 seconds. And now the evidence was everywhere. His aide rushed in and said, "The humans recovered one of the micro-drones intact. Their technician has already traced the chemical payload to a Keshari origin." Mora's scales went completely pale, and he said, "That is not possible. The Pale Court guaranteed total sanitization of all equipment." His aide said, "The Pale Court also guaranteed that the target would be dead. They were wrong about that too." Mora sat down heavily, stared at the wall, and tried to think of a way out of this, and could not find one. Had not only survived the attack, but had captured physical evidence linking it to Keshari resources. And if that evidence was presented to the Concord, then the Keshari would face sanctions that could cripple their economy for decades. And then his door chimed, and his aide checked the identity of the visitor, and went very pale, and said, "It is Ambassador Okonkwo. He is requesting a private meeting." Mora almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The man he had just tried to kill was standing at his door asking to talk. He let him in. Okonkwo entered the Keshari quarters alone, without Voss, without any guard at all, and he sat down across from Mora and folded his hands in his lap, and looked at the Keshari envoy with eyes that held no anger, and no fear, and no accusation, just a calm, steady patience that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon. "Envoy Mora," Okonkwo said, "I think we should talk about what happened today." Mora said nothing, because he did not know what to say. "I am not going to pretend that I do not know who arranged the attack," Okonkwo continued. My security team is very good at what they do, and the evidence is clear, but I did not come here to threaten you, or to demand justice, or to humiliate you in front of the Concord. Mora finally found his voice and said, Then why did you come? Because I want to understand why, Okonkwo said simply. You are not stupid, Envoy. You are many things, but stupid is not one of them. So you must have had a reason, and I would like to hear it. And something in Mora broke, not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, but quietly, like a wall that had been holding back water for too long, finally developing a crack, and he told the truth. He told Okonkwo that the Keshari had been the dominant military power in the Concord for 600 years, and that their entire economy and culture and identity was built on being the strongest, and when humans arrived with their impossible reflexes and their terrifying combat instincts and their bodies that could adapt to almost anything, the Keshari leadership had seen the future, and the future did not have them on top anymore, and they were afraid, deeply and desperately afraid. So you tried to remove us before we could take your place, Okonkwo said, and Mora nodded. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Envoy, humanity did not come to the Concord to replace anyone. We came because we are tired of being alone. We have spent our entire history fighting ourselves because there was no one else to talk to, and now that we finally have neighbors, we do not want to fight them. We want to learn from them and build with them and sit beside them as equals. He paused and then said, You tried to kill me today. That is a fact. But it is also a fact that I am still alive and you are still alive, and tomorrow is a new day. So the question is, what do we do with tomorrow? At him and said, You are offering forgiveness. And Okonkwo shook his head and said, I am offering a conversation. Forgiveness comes later, if we both work for it. Meanwhile, in the human delegation quarters, something very different was happening. Voss sat on a bench, while a medic sealed the cut on Tanaka's arm with a dermal bonding agent, and Tanaka complained that it itched, and Ishida told him to stop being a baby, and Hargrove brewed coffee from a portable kit he had smuggled onto the station, because he refused to go anywhere without real Earth coffee. They were laughing. They were actually laughing, telling jokes, and ribbing each other about their performance, the way soldiers always did after a firefight. And Voss allowed herself a small smile, because her team was alive and unbroken, and that was all that mattered. When Thesic's aide arrived at their quarters to deliver a formal commendation from the senior chair, he found 4 human soldiers sitting around a small table, drinking a dark brown liquid that smelled like burnt wood, and laughing about something that he could not understand. And he stood in the doorway and watched them, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with the footage he had watched of these same 4 people, killing 12 of the deadliest beings in the galaxy. He could not reconcile it. He filed a report about it anyway, and the report was 3 pages long, and the conclusion simply read, I do not understand these people, but I believe we should try. In a quiet corner of the Athenaeum, the Defani delegation was already working, their scholars hunched over data tablets, compiling every scrap of information they could find about human biology and neurology and evolutionary history. And the senior researcher paused halfway through a comparative analysis of reaction times across all known species, and pushed back from her desk and said to no one in particular, They evolved on a death world. Looked up and said, All inhabited planets have predators. And the senior researcher shook her head and said, You do not understand. Their planet did not just have predators. Their planet was the predator. Everything on that world was trying to kill everything else all the time. And humans did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest. They survived by being the most adaptable, and the most persistent, and the most willing to fight back against anything that tried to end them. She looked down at her data and said, They were never safe, not once in their entire evolutionary history, and that is why they are what they are. She named her report Persistence Predators, the implications of evolved lethality in a diplomatic species. and it would become the most downloaded xenobiological document in Concord history. The inner chamber had been cleaned and repaired overnight by maintenance drones that worked in silence and left no trace of what had happened there. And when the delegates filed back in the following morning, the walls were smooth and the platforms were gleaming, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, and nothing at all like blood. But the memory of blood was in every mind in that room, and no amount of cleaning could remove it. Thesic Volaron took his place on the blue Velhari platform and looked out over the assembled Concord and saw something he had never seen before in all his centuries of diplomatic service, which was genuine uncertainty on the faces of species that prided themselves on never being uncertain about anything. The Mojave delegation sat with their feathers drawn tight against their bodies, which was a sign of deep unease, and the Breck rumbled among themselves in voices too low for most translators to pick up, and the Dothani clutched their data tablets and whispered about evolutionary biology, and dozens of other species shifted and murmured and watched the entrance to the chamber with a new kind of attention. They were waiting for the humans, and then the humans arrived. Okonkwo walked in first, tall and composed in a fresh diplomatic uniform, his silver hair catching the starlight from the ceiling, and behind him came Diallo with her quiet grace, and behind her came the 4 soldiers, Voss and Tanaka and Ishida and Hargrove, walking in a loose formation that looked casual but was not casual at all. And every alien eye in the chamber tracked them, the way prey animals track a predator moving through tall grass. Okonkwo noticed this, and it saddened him, because he had not come here to be feared, but he was wise enough to know that fear and respect were often neighbors, and that you sometimes had to walk through one to reach the other. Thesic called the session to order, and his bell voice rang through the chamber. The Concord reconvenes to address the matter of humanity's admission to the inner table. The events of yesterday are known to all, and will be formally investigated by the appropriate bodies. But the question before us today is the same question that was before us yesterday. Does humanity belong among us? He paused, and then said, "Let the vote proceed." The voting was done by species in the order of their admission to the Concord, oldest first, and the first to vote were the Thesic's own people, the Velhari, who had been founding members 11,000 years ago. Thesic stood and said, "The Velhari vote yes," and a murmur went through the chamber, because the Velhari had been expected to abstain, not to vote in favor. And Thesic's glowing eyes swept the room, and he added, "We vote yes, not because of what happened yesterday, but because of what Ambassador Okonkwo said before it happened. He spoke of stubbornness and of refusing to accept that the story is over. And I find that I admire that quality very much." The Dothani voted next, and they voted yes, and their representative said, "We have studied human biology and human history, and we believe that any species that can produce both warriors of such lethality and diplomats of such grace is a species the Concord needs." The Breck voted yes, with a simple rumble of strong. We respect strong. The Mojave voted yes, and their envoy, who was tall and feathered and beautiful, said, "We were afraid of humans before yesterday. Today we are still afraid, but we have decided that it is better to be afraid beside them than afraid across from them." One by one the species voted, and the pattern was clear. Delegations that had been expected to vote no were voting yes, and delegations that had been expected to abstain were voting yes. And the reasons were different for each one, but the underlying truth was the same. The humans had changed the math. Some voted yes, out of genuine admiration, because they had seen Okonkwo's speech and Voss's defense, and recognized something rare, a species that could destroy and chose to protect instead. Some voted yes out of fear, because they had seen what 4 humans with sidearms could do in 2 seconds, and they did not want to find out what a whole planet of humans with warships could do if they felt unwelcome. Some voted yes out of pragmatism, because they understood that humanity was coming to the galactic stage, whether the Concord liked it or not, and it was better to have them inside the tent than outside it. And some voted yes, because they had watched the footage of Okonkwo walking alone and unarmed into the quarters of the man who had tried to murder him, and offering a conversation instead of a threat. And they thought that maybe, just maybe, that kind of courage was exactly what the Concord had been missing. The vote reached the Keshery, and the chamber grew very quiet. Dreth Mora stood on his green platform with all four hands at his sides, and his golden eyes fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. And he was silent for a long time. Long enough that Thesic prompted him by saying, "Envoy Mora, the Concord awaits your vote." Mora looked down at Okonkwo, who stood on the chamber floor, looking back up at him with no expression at all. Just those calm, dark eyes waiting. And Mora remembered what the human had said to him in private, about tomorrow being a new day, and forgiveness coming later, if they both worked for it. "The Keshery abstain," Mora said, and sat down. It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and everyone in the chamber knew why, and Okonkwo gave the smallest nod, barely visible, an acknowledgement between two men who had tried to kill and be killed, and were now choosing a different path. The final count was 31 in favor, 0 against, 3 abstaining, and the result was historic. Not just because humanity was admitted, but because no species in the history of the Concord had ever been admitted with 0 opposition votes. Thesic announced the result, and said, "The Concord welcomes humanity to the inner table. Ambassador Okonkwo, please take your seat." And Okonkwo walked forward across the chamber floor, and stepped onto the white platform, and it rose beneath him, carrying him up to the level of the other delegates. And as it rose, the white light shifted and changed, and became a warm blue-green, the colors of earth, of oceans, and forests, and sky. And Okonkwo stood on that platform and looked out at the galaxy's representatives. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He did not reference the attack. He simply said, "Thank you, all of you. We will not waste this." The chamber erupted in the various sounds that different species use to express approval. Chimes and rumbles and clicks and harmonics. And it was messy and chaotic and beautiful, the way all truly important moments are. Later that evening, when the ceremony was over and the delegations were beginning to disperse, Tesic Valeron found Captain Elara Voss standing alone at a viewport in one of the station's observation corridors, looking out at the stars, with her hands clasped behind her back. He approached her, and she acknowledged his presence with a slight turn of her head, but did not speak, because Voss rarely spoke first. "Captain," Thesic said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Envoy." Thesic stood beside her, and looked out at the same stars, and said, "Your species has been in space for less than a century. You are younger than any of us. Your technology is impressive, but it is not superior to ours. Your numbers are large, but not the largest, and yet yesterday in that chamber, you were the most dangerous thing alive. You and your 3 soldiers killed 12 Pale Court Vreth in 2 seconds. The Pale Court who have terrorized this galaxy for 300 years. Who no one has ever defeated." He turned to look at her, and his glowing eyes searched her face with an intensity that was almost painful. "How?" he asked. "How is that possible?" Voss considered the question, and she thought about all the ways she could answer it. She could talk about cybernetic augmentation, and threat detection AI, and neural link tactical networks. She could talk about military training, and combat doctrine, and the science of human reflexes. She could talk about the way humanity had spent 10,000 years fighting, and killing, and surviving, until violence was encoded into their DNA, like a language they could never unlearn. But none of that was really the answer. The answer was simpler, and older, and deeper than any of that. She looked out at the stars and said, We have been practicing for a lot longer than you think, Envoy. Just not out here. Thesic stared at her and said, "What do you mean?" And Voss turned to face him fully. In her gray eyes, he saw something that he had seen in the eyes of predators on a dozen worlds. Not cruelty, not malice, but a deep and ancient awareness of what it meant to fight for survival every single day. Our world was not kind to us, Voss said. Nothing on our planet wanted us to survive. Not the weather, not the animals, not the diseases, not even each other. And we survived anyway. We survived ice ages that froze our world solid, and plagues that killed half our population, and wars that burned our cities to ash. We survived because we are very, very good at one thing. And what is that? Thesic asked. Refusing to die, Voss said. And then she almost smiled and added, the fighting is just how we express it. Thesic stood there for a long time after Voss walked away, and he stared out at the stars. He thought about what she had said, and he thought about a species that had clawed its way up from mud and blood on a world that was trying to kill them. Every moment of every day, a species that had learned to fight before it learned to speak. A species that carried the memory of 10,000 years of survival in its bones and its blood and its reflexes. And he felt something he could not name at first, something that was not fear and was not awe and was not admiration exactly, but was all of those things combined into a single emotion that he had never needed a word for before, because he had never felt it before. He stood there until the stars wheeled slowly past the viewport, and the station hummed its quiet, endless hum. And finally he identified the feeling. It was respect. Deep and true and unshakable respect for a species that had walked out of the darkness and into the light, and had brought its claws with it, just in case. And standing there in the starlight, Thesic Volaran, who had lived for 400 years and seen empires rise and fall, who had sat at the head of the most powerful political body in the galaxy, who had believed that he understood the universe and everything in it, admitted something to himself that he had never admitted before. He was glad the humans were on his side. He was very, very glad.